Ethan Callaway moved through the glass-paneled lobby of Callaway Holdings with the quiet confidence of a man who was used to having the world bend to his will. His stride was purposeful, his tailored charcoal suit crisp, his Rolex ticking against his wrist like a metronome, keeping his life in perfect order. The city buzzed around him beyond the towering windows. New York, in all its chaotic glory. Pedestrians hurried down Fifth Avenue, yellow cabs fought for space on the streets, and the sky was tinged with the soft pink of late afternoon. But none of it touched him. Ethan lived above it all, literally in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, and figuratively in a world where numbers, power, and precision dictated his every move. As he approached the curb, his black Mercedes Maybach waited, the driver already holding the door open. Ethan barely nodded in acknowledgement. His mind was elsewhere. "Mr. Callaway, the board meeting has been moved up by 10 minutes. His assistant's voice came through his Bluetooth earpiece, efficient and clipped. "Noted," Ethan replied, checking his Patek Philippe watch. He had precisely 27 minutes to reach the Callaway Holdings headquarters downtown. Enough time. Barely. It was a critical meeting, one that could determine the future of the company. The acquisition deal he had spent the last 6 months orchestrating was finally coming to a close. Billions were at stake. His investors expected results. His competitors expected failure. And Ethan? He never failed. The car door was inches from his hand when, "Sir?" A small voice, hesitant yet oddly certain, cut through the hum of traffic. Ethan turned, frowning. 2 little girls stood on the sidewalk a few feet away, their identical dark curls wild from the wind, their wide blue eyes fixed on him with a strange mixture of expectation and curiosity. He scanned the street instinctively, searching for a frantic parent or a lost nanny, but there was no one. The girls stood alone, their small backpacks slung over their shoulders, looking oddly out of place in front of Callaway Tower. "Are you lost?" Ethan asked, his tone controlled even. One of them bit her lip before shaking her head. The other, the slightly bolder one, took a step forward. "We were looking for you." Ethan stiffened. His fingers tightened around the car door handle. Looking for him. He glanced at his watch. 25 minutes until the meeting. He didn't have time for this. "You must be mistaken," he said, glancing between them. "Who's supposed to be watching you?" The girls exchanged a look. A silent conversation passed between them, one that Ethan had no way of deciphering. Then, the bolder one reached into her backpack and pulled out something. A small, worn photograph. She held it out to him. Ethan took it, barely looking, until his breath caught in his throat. It was him, younger, standing next to a woman with warm brown eyes and dark curls, her laughter caught mid-moment. He knew this picture. He knew her. Olivia Carter. His pulse slowed, the city noise fading into a dull hum. "She's our mom," the girl said quietly. Ethan's mind stalled. He forced himself to look at the photograph again, as if seeing it differently would change the reality unraveling before him. He hadn't seen Olivia in nearly 7 years, hadn't thought about her in longer than he cared to admit. And yet, he looked at the girls again. The same curls, the same stubborn tilt of the chin, the same blue eyes. His blue eyes. Ethan inhaled sharply. 24 minutes until the meeting, but for the first time in his life, a meeting was the last thing on his mind. Ethan Callaway had negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced down ruthless competitors, and built an empire from nothing. But nothing, not hostile takeovers, not high-stakes mergers, had ever made his pulse hammer quite like the words that had just left the little girl's lips. "She's our mom." He barely registered the honk of a cab behind him or the weight of the city pressing in. He stared at the photograph in his hand, his own younger face staring back at him, standing next to a woman he had once. No, he wasn't going to finish that thought. This was a mistake, some bizarre misunderstanding. He turned back to the twins, their identical blue eyes locked on him. He swallowed, trying to find the right words, something rational, something logical. "Where is your mother now?" he asked, his voice carefully measured. "At home," the bolder twin answered. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "At home? Does she know you're here?" A pause. The quieter twin, Emma, Lila, shifted, her small fingers twisting around the straps of her backpack. Her hesitation told him everything he needed to know. "No," she admitted softly. Ethan exhaled through his nose. So they had run away. A headache started forming at his temple. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a problem. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, running a hand through his neatly styled hair, now slightly mussed from the wind. "Your mother must be worried sick." "We thought she wouldn't notice," the bolder one, Emma, mumbled. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. Kids. They always thought they were more invisible than they actually were. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. He had a meeting in. He glanced at his watch. 20 minutes. He had investors waiting. He had a deal on the line. But there were also 2 little girls standing in front of him claiming to be his daughters. And that was not something a man just walked away from. He crouched down to their level, leveling them with a steady gaze. "How did you even find me?" The quieter one, Lila maybe, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her backpack and held it out. He took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a printed copy of his company's address. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Where did you get this?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "In a box in Mom's closet," Emma admitted. "She had some letters and papers. We saw your name and looked it up." Ethan inhaled deeply, fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. So Olivia had kept something of him after all these years, even if she had never reached out, even if she had never told him he had children. That thought hit harder than he expected. He should have been angry. He should have been furious. But all he felt was an unsettling mixture of disbelief, confusion, and something else, something deeper, something more dangerous. "All right," he said finally, rising to his full height. He glanced back at the car, his driver watching the exchange from the front seat. He exhaled sharply. There was only one thing to do. "Get in the car," he said, nodding toward the sleek black vehicle. The twins exchanged a look before scrambling inside without hesitation. Ethan followed, settling into the leather seat as he pulled out his phone. He had 19 minutes until his meeting, but some things couldn't wait. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he hadn't seen in years. Olivia Carter. His thumb hovered over the call button. Then, with a slow exhale, he put the phone down. Some things had to be handled face to face. The drive to Brooklyn was quieter than Ethan had expected. The twins sat in the back, their small bodies dwarfed by the luxurious leather seats. He had expected them to be afraid or anxious, but they weren't. If anything, they were watching him, studying him the way someone might observe a wild animal they weren't sure was dangerous or not. They weren't the only ones doing the studying. Ethan caught their reflections in the rearview mirror, noticing the small details. The way Lila tapped her fingers against her knee in a rhythmic pattern. The way Emma's head tilted slightly when she was curious about something. And those eyes. His eyes. Damn it. For the first time in a long time, Ethan had no idea what to do. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, of knowing the next move before anyone else. But nothing in his carefully structured world had prepared him for this. For fatherhood. The thought sent a foreign, unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. His gaze flickered back to the mirror. The girls were whispering now, exchanging conspiratorial looks. "What?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Emma, or was it Lila, grinned. "You look like you're going to pass out," she observed. Ethan let out a slow breath, dragging a hand down his face. Maybe he was. Before he could respond, the car slowed, pulling up to a modest townhouse on a quiet street. It was nothing like his penthouse in Manhattan. No gleaming marble, no floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But it was warm, lived in, and it was home to her. Before Ethan could fully prepare himself, the front door burst open. And there she was, Olivia Carter. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, her face flushed with panic, her hands gripping the sides of the doorframe like she needed something to hold on to. Her eyes locked onto the twins first, checking them, scanning them, making sure they were safe. And then finally, they landed on him. Something flashed in them. Shock, anger, and something else, something raw and unfinished. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway felt completely, utterly unprepared. The door slammed open wider, and before he could say a single word, Olivia was storming down the steps. Her voice was tight, laced with barely restrained emotion. "What the hell are you doing here, Ethan?" Ethan exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze head-on. "The girls were looking for me." He saw the way her jaw clenched, how her fingers curled into fists. "I know," she bit out, "because they're my daughters." She let the words hang between them, sharp and cutting. Ethan held her gaze, his voice lower when he answered. "They're mine too." A silence stretched between them, thick with things unspoken. The city buzzed in the background, but in that moment, it was just the two of them. And two little girls caught in the middle of something they didn't yet understand. Olivia inhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them again, the fury had dimmed, but not disappeared. "Get inside," she said, stepping back toward the door. It wasn't an invitation, it was a reckoning. And Ethan knew, without a doubt, that his life would never be the same again. Ethan Calloway followed Olivia Carter into her home, the air thick with unspoken words, the weight of 7 years pressing down on them both. The door shut behind him with a decisive click, and he took in the space, small but warm, filled with signs of a life he had never been a part of. Children's artwork covered the walls, a stack of books sat on the coffee table, and the faint scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. It was nothing like the cold, minimalist perfection of his penthouse. This house was lived in, and he had been a ghost in it. The twins scurried past him, kicking off their sneakers by the door. They disappeared down the hall, their voices a soft hum as they whispered between themselves. Olivia, still standing near the door, finally turned to face him. She looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. The Olivia he had known years ago had been fire and independence, a woman who had challenged him in ways no one else ever had. The woman standing in front of him now was still all those things. But there was something new in her posture, in the way she stood, arms crossed over her chest, as if bracing for a battle she had never planned to fight. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets, his voice measured. "You weren't going to tell me." Olivia let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Don't act so surprised." He should have been furious. Any other man in his position would be. But instead, all he could feel was a slow, creeping sense of regret, and something deeper. "They came looking for me," he said, quieter this time. "They wanted to know who I was." She stiffened, her arms tightening around herself. "And now you do. So what happens next?" Ethan inhaled slowly. He had spent his entire life controlling situations, ensuring outcomes. But here? In this house, with Olivia staring at him like she wasn't sure whether to throw him out or break down in tears, He didn't have a damn clue. "They're my daughters," he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue, unreal. Olivia's expression hardened. "They're mine too, and for the last 6 years I've been the only one raising them." A sharp pang settled in his chest. She wasn't wrong. Silence stretched between them, thick with years of distance and missed chances. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged with something raw. Olivia scoffed, running a hand through her dark curls. "You really have to ask." She let out a humorless laugh, pacing the small space. "Ethan, when I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You were moving up, building an empire, traveling the world, making deals that would make you richer than God. And I—" She shook her head. "I knew what would happen if I told you." His jaw tightened. "What? You assumed I wouldn't care?" She turned to him, her gaze sharp. "Number, I assumed you'd feel obligated. And I didn't want that. I didn't want you showing up because you felt like you had to. I wanted you in their lives because you wanted to be." Ethan exhaled, running a hand down his face. "That wasn't your decision to make." Her eyes flashed with something dangerously close to hurt before she masked it with defiance. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but I made it anyway." Another silence fell between them, but this one felt heavier. Ethan glanced toward the hallway where the twins had disappeared. The weight of what he had missed settled deep in his bones. Their first steps, their first words, their birthdays. He had been absent from their lives not by his own choice but by hers. And yet, would he have been ready back then? Would he have been the kind of father they needed? He didn't know, and that terrified him. The sound of small footsteps broke the tension. Ethan turned just as Emma and Lila reappeared, both of them holding stuffed animals under their arms, watching the two adults with cautious curiosity. "Are you going to yell at each other the whole time?" Lila asked bluntly. Olivia sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "No, baby, we're just talking." Emma tilted her head skeptical. "You don't look like you're just talking." Ethan almost smirked. The girl had nerve. Olivia took a deep breath before crouching down in front of them. "You two ran off today, and that was not okay. We're going to talk about that later, but first, I need you to listen to me." She glanced at Ethan before continuing. "I know you have a lot of questions, and I know meeting Ethan was a big deal. But this is something we need to figure out together. Okay?" The girls nodded, though their gazes flickered back to Ethan with something unreadable. Olivia straightened, her arms still crossed, as if preparing for battle once again. "I think you should go now." Ethan's spine stiffened. "Excuse me?" She gestured toward the door. "We need time. I need time. And they—" She looked toward the twins, her voice softer. "Need to process this. It's been a long day." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. He wasn't a man who backed down. But for once, this wasn't about a fight. It was about earning his place. He nodded, forcing himself to step back toward the door. But before he could leave, Emma piped up. "Are you coming back?" The simple question made something inside him shift. Ethan turned, meeting the little girl's expectant gaze. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be back." He wasn't sure who looked more surprised, Olivia or the girls. But as he stepped out into the crisp evening air, one thought settled deep into his bones. For the first time in his life, he wasn't walking away. Ethan Callaway had built his empire by understanding one simple truth: persistence won. It was why Callaway Holdings dominated the financial world. It was why he had turned a small investment firm into a billion-dollar powerhouse before the age of 35. It was why his name carried weight in every boardroom from Manhattan to Hong Kong. And yet, for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to win. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. The hum of the city, the neon signs flashing past the tinted windows, the familiar Manhattan skyline rising in the distance, none of it reached him. His mind was still in that small Brooklyn townhouse, with them, with her. He poured himself a whiskey the moment he stepped into his penthouse, the glass cool against his fingers as he leaned against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The view, once a reminder of his dominance, felt hollow tonight. He had daughters. Daughters. The word felt foreign, like something that belonged to another man's life. Not his. Not Ethan Callaway, the man who worked 70-hour weeks, who thrived on control and precision. And yet, he pictured their faces, the sharp curiosity in Lila's gaze, the quiet contemplation in Emma's. How easily they had assessed him. How unafraid they were to ask the questions no one else would dare. He had spent years avoiding entanglements, convinced that emotions were liabilities. But those girls? They weren't liabilities. They were his. And Olivia? Ethan exhaled slowly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He had expected her anger. He had expected her resistance. But what he hadn't expected was the way she had looked at him. Like she wasn't sure if she wanted to throw him out or break down in front of him. Like part of her had been waiting for this moment, even if she hadn't wanted to. She was still the same Olivia, sharp, passionate, stubborn as hell. The woman who had once loved him, and the woman who had walked away. And for the first time since she had left, he was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, she had been right to do it. But that didn't mean he was going to let this go. Ethan Callaway didn't walk away from a challenge. And this? This was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. 2 days passed before Ethan showed up again. He had wanted to go back immediately, but even he knew he needed to tread carefully. Olivia was already on edge, and forcing his way in wouldn't win him anything. So instead, he waited, strategized, and then he showed up, unannounced. The Brooklyn neighborhood was quiet in the early evening, a stark contrast to the constant energy of Manhattan. Olivia's house stood the same, modest, warm, lived in. Ethan stepped out of his car and approached the door, hesitating for only a second before knocking. The sound of small footsteps came first, followed by hushed whispers. Then, the door swung open. Lila stood there, blinking up at him, arms crossed over her chest. "Took you long enough." Ethan smirked. "I told you I'd be back." She studied him for a moment before tilting her head. We'll see." With that, she turned and walked away. Ethan blinked, barely suppressing a laugh. So that's how this was going to go. Footsteps approached, heavier this time. Then, Olivia appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Ethan." He took in the way she stood, arms crossed, blocking the entrance like a shield. She had always been good at guarding herself. "I came to see them," he said simply. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And you think just showing up is enough?" "It's a start." She studied him for a long moment. He could see the battle happening behind her eyes. The part of her that wanted to push him away, and the part of her that knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Finally, she sighed, stepping aside. "They're in the backyard," she said. Ethan nodded and stepped inside. It was the first time he had been invited in. The backyard was small but comfortable, lined with potted plants and a wooden deck. The twins sat on the grass with a plastic tea set between them, their faces lighting up when they saw him. "You actually came," Emma said, grinning. Ethan lowered himself onto the deck steps, raising an eyebrow. "What? You thought I wouldn't?" Lila shrugged. A lot of people say things they don't mean. The words landed heavier than he expected. Ethan met her gaze, serious now. I'm not one of those people. She held his stare for a moment longer before nodding, satisfied. Then she handed him a tiny pink teacup. Here, you're late, so you get the ugly one. Ethan huffed a quiet laugh, taking the small cup between two fingers. Lucky me. Emma giggled. Mom says rich people don't drink pretend tea. Ethan smirked, shooting a glance toward the kitchen window where Olivia stood watching. Well, your mom is wrong. He raised the cup and took an exaggerated sip. Delicious. Lila snorted. You're such a liar. He grinned. I prefer the term good businessman. The girls laughed, and Ethan felt something shift. It was small, subtle, but it was real. A crack in the wall between them. The first step in something he wasn't willing to lose. Inside the house, Olivia leaned against the counter, arms folded as she watched through the window. Monica, her best friend, leaned in beside her. So, he's actually here. Olivia exhaled, rubbing her temple. Yeah, he is. Monica arched a brow. And how do we feel about that? Olivia glanced back at Ethan, the way he sat on the grass, letting the girls talk his ear off, the way he looked at them like he was actually seeing them for the first time. She had spent years convincing herself that she had done the right thing by keeping him out of their lives. But now? Now she wasn't so sure. Monica nudged her. You're thinking too hard. Olivia let out a breath. It's what I do. Monica grinned. I'm aware. She tilted her head toward the window. But maybe just this once, stop thinking and let him prove you wrong. Olivia didn't answer, because deep down, that was the one thing she was most afraid of, that Ethan Callaway might actually be different, and that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't leaving this time. Ethan Callaway had sat at countless high-stakes negotiation tables, where millions, sometimes billions, were on the line. He had spent his life mastering control, knowing exactly how to wield power, when to speak, and when to let silence do the heavy lifting. But sitting across from Olivia Carter at her small kitchen table, this was the first time he truly felt out of his depth. The twins were upstairs now, their giggles occasionally filtering down through the ceiling as they got ready for bed. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow through the window, making the small kitchen feel even more intimate than it already was. Olivia sat across from him, arms crossed, her dark eyes unreadable. The tension between them was thick. Not the heated electric kind they had once shared in the past, but something heavier, something complicated. I didn't expect you to stay for dinner, she said finally, breaking the silence. Ethan shrugged, leaning back slightly. They asked me to. They ask for a lot of things, Olivia murmured, tracing the rim of her mug with a finger. Ethan didn't miss the unspoken warning in her voice. I told you I'm not going anywhere. Olivia exhaled sharply, shaking her head as she sat up straighter. Ethan, showing up one day doesn't make you a father. His jaw tightened. He had known this conversation was coming. He had expected her to push back, to test him, but hearing the words still made something inside him coil. I never said it did, she scoffed. You're here now. Great. But what happens when work gets in the way? When some billion-dollar deal pulls you back into your world and suddenly... She snapped her fingers. You're gone again? Ethan's fingers curled against the wooden table. I don't walk away from things, Olivia. Her expression darkened. Don't you? The weight of what she wasn't saying settled between them. 7 years ago. That last night together. The moment when they had stood at a crossroads, and he had chosen his career over her. Olivia let out a slow breath, leaning back in her chair. Look, I get it. You're here now and you think that's enough. But I've spent 6 years raising them alone, Ethan. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every fever at 3 a.m., that was me. Not you. The comment landed heavier than it should have. Because maybe, in her world, people did forget. Maybe grown-ups made promises with good intentions and never followed through. Ethan crouched slightly, meeting her gaze. I don't forget things, Lila. She studied him for a long moment, then shrugged, stepping aside to let him in. Okay, we'll see. It was a test, just like Olivia had warned him, and he intended to pass. Inside, Emma was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, a set of colored pencils spread out in front of her. She looked up when Ethan walked in, her eyes widening slightly before she smiled. You came back, she said simply. Yeah, Ethan said, settling into the armchair near the couch. I did. Emma picked up a blue pencil and resumed coloring. Good. We were waiting for you. That shouldn't have hit as hard as it did. Ethan glanced toward the kitchen, where Olivia was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. She wasn't saying anything, but she was watching. She was always watching, making sure he didn't mess this up. He turned his attention back to the girls. What are you working on? A school project, Lila said, plopping down next to her sister. We're supposed to draw a picture of our family. Ethan's stomach tightened. He looked at the paper in front of them. There was Olivia, drawn in careful detail, long brown hair, a soft smile, 2 smaller figures beside her, both with identical dark curls and bright blue eyes, but the space next to them was empty. Emma tapped her pencil against the paper. Mom said we should just draw the 3 of us, but our teacher says families come in all shapes. Lila looked up at Ethan, her gaze unreadable. What do you think? Ethan hesitated. He knew the answer he wanted to give, but he also knew he had no right to demand a place in that drawing. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward, picking up a black pencil and drawing something in the empty space. Lila and Emma leaned in, watching as he carefully sketched out a small open door. They exchanged a look, brows furrowed. What's that supposed to be? Lila asked. Ethan met her gaze. It means I'm here, and if you want me to be in the picture, you get to decide when. Emma's fingers tightened around her pencil, her expression contemplative. Lila tilted her head, considering. Huh. Olivia, still leaning in the doorway, exhaled softly. Ethan didn't look at her, but he could feel the shift in the air. Something small, something important. Later, when the girls had gone upstairs to play, Ethan found himself standing in Olivia's tiny kitchen as she filled a glass of water. That was smart, she said finally, not turning around. Ethan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. What was? The way you handled the drawing. She glanced at him over her shoulder. Most men would have just assumed they belonged in the picture. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand along the back of his neck. I know better than to assume anything with you. A small smirk played at her lips, but she shook her head. You're really not the same, are you? The question hit him harder than expected. He turned to face her fully. Would it be easier if I was? She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the glass. Maybe. A silence stretched between them. He could still remember the last time they had stood this close, years ago, back when everything had been simple and complicated all at once. Back when he had wanted her, but not enough to stay. Back when she had wanted him, but not enough to fight. And now they had unfinished business standing between them. A past they had never fully let go of. A future neither of them knew how to navigate. Finally, Olivia set the glass down and met his gaze. They like you. A lot. Ethan's throat tightened. I know. Her voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. Don't break their hearts, Ethan. The words weren't a warning. They were a command. Ethan nodded slowly. I won't. And for the first time, Olivia didn't argue. She just watched him, waiting, testing, and maybe, just maybe, hoping. Upstairs, the twins sat on their bed, whispering. He's different than I thought, Emma murmured, hugging her stuffed bear. Lila nodded. Yeah. A pause. Then Emma reached for the colored pencil and leaned over their drawing. Carefully, she added him in. Not in the center, not next to them, but just outside the open door, waiting. As Ethan left the house that evening, stepping into the cool night air, he realized something. He had spent years chasing success, closing deals, and proving his worth to people who never really mattered. But this was the most important deal of his life. And for the first time, he was willing to take it slow. Because some things weren't about winning. Some things were about earning. And Ethan Callaway was ready to earn everything. Ethan Callaway had spent his life making decisions that affected thousands of people. Markets moved when he spoke. Investors bet fortunes on his instincts. He was a man who made choices and never looked back. But as he sat in his sleek black car, parked outside Olivia's Brooklyn townhouse, he realized that this moment, this choice, was the one that truly mattered. And for the first time, looking back was exactly what he needed to do. He wasn't surprised when Olivia found him outside. She stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the chill of the night, watching him with that sharp, assessing gaze of hers. She had always been able to see through him in ways no one else ever had. Slowly, she descended the steps and walked toward his car, stopping just outside the open driver's side window. You just gonna sit there all night? She asked softly. Ethan exhaled, running a hand along his jaw. Maybe. A ghost of a smile flickered at her lips, but it didn't last. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. There had been a time when silence between them had been comfortable, the kind of quiet where words weren't necessary because their bodies spoke for them, their hearts beating in time. But now, the silence was heavy. Now it was full of everything they had never said. Olivia sighed and glanced down the street, as if looking at anything other than him would make this easier. You keep showing up, she murmured. Ethan nodded. I told you I would. She let out a soft, bitter laugh. Yeah, but the problem isn't you showing up now, Ethan. The problem is that you left before. There it was. The thing neither of them had really said out loud yet. The real reason why she had never told him about the girls. The real reason why she wasn't sure if she could trust him now. Ethan clenched his jaw, looking away. He didn't have an excuse for that night 7 years ago, but he remembered it. Too well. 7 years ago. It had been late. The air in Olivia's tiny apartment had been thick with summer heat, their bodies tangled in the sheets, the hum of the city drifting through the open window. Ethan had been staring at the ceiling, his mind already elsewhere, already on the deal he had been preparing for, the one that would take him out of the country for months. Olivia had known. She had always been able to tell when he was pulling away. You're leaving, she had murmured, her fingers tracing absent patterns against his skin. Ethan had exhaled. It's just a trip. She had gone quiet then, her hand stilling. He had turned his head to find her watching him, her dark eyes filled with something he hadn't been ready to face. No, she had whispered. It's not just a trip, and we both know it. He had wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she meant more to him than his career, that he could balance both. But the truth was, at the time, he hadn't been able to. He had chosen his future, and he had let her go. Now, sitting in his car, looking at the woman he had once let slip through his fingers, Ethan finally understood what that decision had cost him. It hadn't just been Olivia he had lost. It had been everything. The life he could have had. The moments he had missed. Their daughter's first steps, their first words, their first everything. Ethan swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. "I was an idiot," he said finally. Olivia let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, I could have told you that 7 years ago." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different. Less like a wall, more like a door. Slowly, Olivia exhaled and crossed her arms. "I spent so many years being angry at you," she admitted, "for leaving, for choosing that life instead of me." She didn't say it. She didn't have to. Ethan's chest tightened. "I regret it," he said, his voice raw. "Every day." Olivia blinked, her breath hitching slightly. "Then why didn't you ever come back?" Ethan hesitated, because he had been afraid. Because the longer he had stayed away, the harder it had been to imagine a version of the future where she still wanted him. Because he had assumed she had moved on. Because he hadn't known about the girls. Because, "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm here now." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "And what exactly does that mean?" Ethan inhaled deeply. "It means I want to fix this." She let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "You can't just fix 7 years of absence, Ethan. It doesn't work like that." "I know," he said. And he did. But he also knew something else. That he had spent years chasing the wrong kind of success. That all the power and money in the world meant nothing if he didn't have something real to come home to. And that Olivia, and those 2 little girls sleeping upstairs, were the only thing that had ever really mattered. Finally, Olivia sighed. "You really aren't giving up, are you?" Ethan met her gaze, steady and sure. "No." She exhaled. "Then don't make me regret letting you try." And for the first time in a long time, hope settled in Ethan's chest. Because this was a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Inside, Lila peeked through the upstairs window, watching as her mother and Ethan stood together in the night. "Do you think he's going to stay?" she whispered. Emma, curled up in bed, pulled her blanket up to her chin. "I think he wants to." Lila was quiet for a long moment. Then, she turned back to the window, watching as Ethan lingered a second longer before finally walking back to his car. "Well," she murmured, "I guess we'll see." As Ethan drove away, his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. A text from his assistant. "New contract meeting moved up. Board wants an answer by Monday. Deal's yours if you want it." He stared at the screen. A year ago, this would have been everything. Now it felt like a distraction. His fingers hovered over the reply. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned the phone over and kept driving. For the first time in his life, he had something more important to come back to. Ethan Callaway had spent a lifetime proving himself in boardrooms, mastering the art of strategy, control, and execution. But as he stood in Olivia Carter's small Brooklyn kitchen, watching their twin daughters chatter over bowls of cereal, he realized something. There was no strategy for this. No carefully laid out plan. No script to follow. Being a father wasn't about control. It was about showing up. And today, he was here. "Mom says you don't know how to cook," Lila announced, spoon poised over her cereal. Ethan arched an eyebrow, glancing at Olivia, who was pouring coffee with a knowing smirk. "Did she?" Olivia shrugged, unbothered. "You don't." He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I know how to cook." Emma's eyes lit up. "Really?" Ethan nodded. "I make a mean omelet." Lila tilted her head. "What's in it?" "Eggs." A beat of silence. Then both girls burst into giggles. Oh, wow, Lila gasped dramatically. An omelet with eggs? That's incredible. Emma clutched her stomach, laughing. What else is in it? Ethan smirked, crossing his arms. Depends. Sometimes cheese, maybe some ham if I'm feeling fancy. Lila wiped a pretend tear from her eye. A fancy omelet. You should open a restaurant. Ethan shot Olivia a look. Are they always like this? Olivia took a slow sip of her coffee, eyes twinkling with amusement. You have no idea. Ethan turned back to the twins, tapping a finger on the counter. All right, comedians. You keep making fun of my cooking and I won't share my secret pancake recipe. The girl's eyes went wide. You know how to make pancakes? Emma asked, as if this were the single most important question of the day. Ethan nodded, leaning in. The best pancakes. Better than any diner. Better than any cafe. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Better than your mom's. Olivia's scoff was immediate. Excuse me? Ethan grinned, enjoying this far too much. I said what I said. The twins were delighted. This is war, Lila declared. Mom, you have to make pancakes now. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, pancake battle. Olivia sighed, shaking her head. I'm not getting into a competition over pancakes. Lila turned to Ethan. That sounds like something someone who's afraid of losing would say. Ethan bit back a laugh. That's exactly what I was thinking. Olivia groaned, rubbing her temples. I'm living in a house full of traitors. The twins cheered, already demanding pancakes for dinner. Ethan just watched them, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. Maybe this was what he had been missing all these years. Later that afternoon, after Olivia had taken the twins to their dance class, Ethan found himself still lingering at the house. It was strange, how quickly he had started feeling comfortable here. The walls weren't just walls. They were covered in tiny fingerprints, in drawings taped to the fridge, in little pieces of a life that had gone on without him. And the more time he spent in this house, the more he wanted to be a part of it. Olivia re-entered, shaking out her coat, her hair slightly damp from the cold drizzle that had started outside. She raised an eyebrow when she saw him still standing there. You didn't leave, she noted. He leaned against the counter. I wasn't done annoying you yet. A smirk, quick, barely there. But he caught it. Olivia moved to the stove, setting the kettle to boil. You've spent more time here this week than you probably have in any house that wasn't a penthouse or a hotel suite. Ethan didn't argue, because she was right. For years, his idea of home had been sleek, modern spaces with floor-to-ceiling windows, places that looked good on the outside but were always empty inside. But this house? This felt like home, because it held them, and no amount of money could ever buy that. Olivia turned, arms crossed. You're serious about this, aren't you? Ethan met her gaze. Yeah, I am. She studied him for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes. And then, in a voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it, she asked, Why now? Ethan exhaled. He could have given her a dozen answers. Because the girls had found him. Because he had spent years chasing the wrong things. Because he didn't want to be the kind of man who looked back on his life and saw nothing but regret. But in the end, there was only one answer that mattered. Because I should have been here all along. A beat of silence. Then, Olivia nodded. It wasn't an acceptance. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. That evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Ethan lingered at the door, his hand resting on the knob. Olivia stood a few feet away, watching him carefully. He hesitated. Then, quietly, Good night, Olivia. Her lips parted slightly as if she wasn't expecting that. And then, softer than before, softer than she had spoken to him in years. Good night, Ethan. As he stepped outside into the crisp night air, something inside him settled. He wasn't just fighting for them anymore. He was earning them. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted. Ethan Callaway wasn't a man who hesitated. Hesitation cost deals. It cost opportunities. And yet, as he stood outside Olivia's townhouse for the fourth evening in a row, hand poised over the doorbell, he hesitated. Because this wasn't just a house. It was their home. A place where he had no claim, at least not yet. But if he wanted to be in his daughters' lives, if he wanted to prove to Olivia that this wasn't a passing whim, then he had to keep showing up, no matter how uncomfortable it made either of them. So he pressed the doorbell. This time he didn't have to wait long. The door opened, and Olivia stood there, her hair loose around her shoulders, eyes sharp as ever. She looked tired, not in a way that suggested exhaustion, but in a way that told him she had spent the entire day convincing herself she wasn't expecting him to come back. And yet, here he was. "You really don't have an off switch, do you?" she asked, leaning against the frame. Ethan smirked. "Would you believe me if I said I'm learning?" Olivia sighed, shaking her head. "Lila and Emma are upstairs. You can go up." It wasn't exactly warm, but it was permission, and that was something. Upstairs he found the twins sprawled across their bedroom floor, a board game between them. Lila noticed him first, her head snapping up. "You came." Ethan smirked, stepping inside. "I said I would, didn't I?" Emma grinned. "We saved you a spot, but fair warning, Lila cheats." "I do not," Lila gasped, looking scandalized. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "Only if you like winning," Emma said. Ethan chuckled as he lowered himself onto the floor. "Good thing I do like winning." The next 30 minutes were filled with fast-paced, ridiculous competitiveness, Lila and Emma ganging up on him with zero remorse. He found himself actually laughing, not the polite, controlled chuckle he used in meetings, but real laughter. The kind he hadn't felt in years. It was easy. Too easy. And that terrified him. Because easy meant he was falling. Not just for the twins, but for this life, for this house, for Olivia, and the warmth that still lingered in the air long after she'd left the room. Ethan had spent his whole life building walls around himself. And yet, these two little girls had managed to break right through them. By the time he stepped back downstairs, Olivia was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The scent of something warm and familiar still hung in the air. For a second, Ethan just stood there watching her. This was different from the high-profile restaurants he was used to, from the perfectly curated spaces where everything was designed to be photographed and admired. This question mark. This was real. She must have felt his gaze because she glanced up, eyeing him warily. "They didn't convince you to stay for a sleepover, did they?" Ethan smirked. "They tried." Olivia snorted, shaking her head. "I'm sure they did." For a moment neither of them spoke. The kitchen was too small, too intimate, the air between them crackling with something dangerous. And suddenly Ethan wasn't thinking about the past, or the girls, or all the things standing between them. He was just thinking about her. The way she had once felt under his hands, the way she had fit so perfectly against him, like she had been made to be there. And God help him, he wanted to know if that fire was still there. So he took a step closer. Not much, just enough to test the space between them. Enough to feel the way her breath caught. Enough to see her fingers tighten around the edge of the counter. Her gaze flickered to his lips, quick, involuntary. But he caught it, because he was still Ethan Callaway, and he knew when someone wanted him. His voice was lower when he spoke. "Olivia," she shook her head quickly, taking a step back. "Don't." Just like that, the spell was broken. Ethan exhaled, jaw tightening, He should have known better. Olivia turned away, gripping the counter as if she needed the distance. This is already complicated enough. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. I know. She turned, her dark eyes hard now. Do you? Ethan swallowed. Olivia. No, she cut him off. Listen to me, Ethan. The girls are starting to trust you. And if you do this, if we even think about going down this road again, what happens when it doesn't work? Ethan's chest tightened, because the unspoken words were right there, lingering between them. What happens when you leave again? He had no answer for that, because he didn't want to leave. But the truth was, neither of them knew what this was or what it could be. So he did the one thing he never did. He backed off. For now. Exhaling slowly, he nodded. Okay. Olivia hesitated, like she hadn't expected him to agree so easily. But then, something in her posture softened, just slightly. Ethan ran a hand down his face, stepping back. Good night, Olivia. She exhaled, arms still folded across her chest. Good night, Ethan. And for the first time, Ethan walked away before she could. Because this wasn't a battle to win. This was something he had to earn. And he'd be damned if he lost her twice. Ethan Callaway had spent years making decisions that affected entire industries, playing chess with billion-dollar deals, and bending the world to his will. But nothing had prepared him for a Saturday afternoon at the park with his daughters. Lila and Emma had insisted on it, their faces practically glowing when he had shown up at their house that morning. Olivia hadn't argued, though her expression had held the quiet skepticism she always wore around him, as if she were waiting for the moment he'd decide this wasn't worth his time. She didn't say it, but he knew she was thinking it. Which was exactly why he was here now, sitting on a park bench as his daughters sprinted across the grass, their laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air. They had barely stopped moving since they arrived, climbing the jungle gym, running to the swings, challenging each other to see who could go down the slide the fastest. Ethan had expected them to slow down eventually. He had severely underestimated their energy. You're going to have to chase them eventually, Olivia's voice came from beside him. Ethan turned to find her standing there, arms crossed, amusement flickering in her dark eyes. She had chosen a spot on the grass instead of the bench, her boots tucked beneath her, the sunlight catching in her loose curls. He smirked. I didn't take you for the type to enjoy watching me suffer. She raised an eyebrow. Oh, I am absolutely that type. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head before looking back at the girls. Lila was attempting to climb a rock wall while Emma cheered her on. How do you do it? He asked, quieter this time. Olivia tilted her head. Do what? He gestured vaguely. This. Every day. The energy, the chaos. Keeping up with them. A soft, knowing smile crossed her lips. I don't keep up with them, Ethan. I just try not to fall too far behind. He let out a quiet breath, watching the way her face softened when she looked at the twins. They were everything to her. And suddenly, he realized just how much she had sacrificed to make sure they had a good life. She hadn't had a partner in this. She hadn't had him. And that was on him. Ethan swallowed, glancing away. I missed a lot. Olivia's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't look at him. Yeah, she murmured. You did. The weight of those words settled deep in his chest. There was no fixing the years he had missed, no undoing the moments he had lost. But he could be here now, and that had to count for something. A few minutes later, Lila came sprinting toward them, breathless and grinning. Come push us on the swings, she demanded, grabbing Ethan's hand and pulling with surprising strength for someone so small. Ethan barely had a chance to react before she was dragging him toward the playground. Olivia laughed, shaking her head. Good luck, she called. He shot her a look over his shoulder. You planned this, didn't you? She shrugged, grinning. Maybe. Ethan sighed, but he didn't fight it. Because if his daughters wanted him to push them on the swings, then that was exactly what he was going to do. By the time they got back to the house that evening, the girls were exhausted. Lila barely made it through brushing her teeth before collapsing onto her bed. Emma yawned so hard mid-sentence that she didn't even finish her story about the butterfly they had seen at the park. Ethan helped Olivia tuck them in, standing by the door as she pressed a kiss to each of their foreheads. As she stood, Emma turned sleepily toward Ethan. "You're coming back tomorrow, right?" she mumbled, blinking up at him. Ethan's chest tightened, because there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt. She believed he would, and that meant more than any business deal he had ever closed. He crouched beside the bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah, sweetheart," he murmured. "I'll be here." Emma smiled sleepily before rolling over, already halfway to dreaming. Lila, from the other bed, mumbled, "You better bring pancakes." Ethan smirked. "I'll see what I can do." Once the girls were asleep, Olivia and Ethan made their way back downstairs, the quiet of the house settling around them. Olivia sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "I think that's the longest they've ever stayed outside without complaining about something." Ethan chuckled. "I'll take that as a win." She glanced at him then, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "Today was good," she admitted softly. Ethan met her gaze. "Yeah," he murmured. "It was." They stood there for a moment, too close, too familiar, the weight of old memories pressing in. And for a second, Ethan could have sworn he saw it, the spark that had never really left between them. But then Olivia looked away, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Don't be late tomorrow," she murmured. Ethan smiled, something warm settling in his chest. "I wouldn't dare." As he stepped out into the cool night, one thought settled deep in his bones. He was falling, not just for the twins, but for her. And this time, he wasn't going to let her go. Ethan Calloway had been balancing two worlds for weeks now, corporate mogul by day, father in training by night. And so far, he was winning. He had shown up for dance classes, school pickups, late-night storytelling sessions. He had taken Lila and Emma out for ice cream, let them convince him to wear ridiculous paper crowns at a birthday party, and even sat through an entire animated movie with talking animals, something he never would have done before. Most importantly, he had proven to Olivia that he wasn't just here out of guilt. He was here to stay, until his past threatened to pull him away. It started with a phone call. Ethan had just finished helping Olivia clear the dinner table, the girls upstairs getting ready for bed. The scent of whatever candle she had burning, vanilla maybe, lingered in the air, making the small kitchen feel too warm, too intimate. His phone buzzed on the counter. Olivia barely glanced up as he reached for it, her hands full with dishes. But the second he saw the name flashing on the screen, something inside him went cold. Daniel Reed, his right-hand man, his closest confidant in the company, and the person who wouldn't be calling unless something was very, very wrong. Ethan answered, stepping away. "Daniel?" A pause. Then his friend's voice came through, tight and clipped. "We have a problem." Ethan's shoulders stiffened. "What kind of problem?" "The board." A long exhale. "They're pushing for the London deal." Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. "That deal was dead," he said, lowering his voice as he turned toward the back door. He could feel Olivia's eyes on him now, like she knew whatever this was. It wasn't good. "Not anymore," Daniel said grimly. "They want it, and they want you to make it happen." Ethan's jaw clenched. London, 6 months overseas, a major merger that would change the landscape of his company, of the entire industry. A deal he would have taken in a heartbeat just months ago. Now? Now it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. "They can't make me go," Ethan said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't that simple. "You're the CEO, Ethan," Daniel said. "They can't force you. But they can make your life a hell of a lot harder if you refuse." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Of course they could. This was what he had built. An empire. A company too powerful, too hungry, to wait for a leader who suddenly had priorities. "Look," Daniel continued, "I'm not saying take it, but you need to make a decision. Soon." Ethan swallowed, staring blankly at the darkened street beyond Olivia's yard. A decision, like the one he had made all those years ago, the one that had cost him everything. "Yeah," he muttered. "I got it." "Good," Daniel said, "because they expect your answer by Monday." Then the line went dead. Ethan stayed outside for a long moment, gripping the phone in his palm, his mind racing. This wasn't just another deal. This was his past. The same choice he had faced before: success or something real, power or family. And this time he wasn't walking away. When he finally stepped back inside, Olivia was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching him with that look, the one that said she knew exactly what kind of call that had been. And she wasn't going to let him lie. "Something wrong?" she asked casually, drying her hands on a dish towel. Ethan met her gaze, considering his next words carefully. Because if there was one thing Olivia wouldn't forgive, it was a lie. So he told her the truth. "The company wants me to take a deal in London," he said. Her face didn't change, but he saw the way her fingers tightened around the fabric of the towel. "For how long?" "6 months." A beat of silence. Then Olivia let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "Of course." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I haven't decided anything." "Yet?" Her tone was clipped, but there was something else underneath it. Something dangerous. And suddenly Ethan realized this wasn't just about the deal. This was about the past. About history repeating itself. "You think I'm going to leave?" he said, the realization landing hard in his chest. Olivia exhaled sharply, shoving the towel onto the counter. "I think this is exactly the kind of choice you've made before." That was years ago. And now it's happening again. She folded her arms, eyes flashing. "So tell me, Ethan, what's different this time?" Everything. Absolutely everything. But how could he make her believe that? How could he convince her that he wasn't the same man who had walked away all those years ago? Before he could answer, small footsteps echoed from the stairs. They both turned. Lila and Emma stood at the bottom step, still in their pajamas, sleepy and confused. "Are you guys fighting?" Lila asked, rubbing her eyes. Ethan's chest tightened. Because suddenly it wasn't just about Olivia anymore. It was about them. And the way their voices sounded so small, so unsure, like they had already learned that grown-ups sometimes left. And Ethan, he refused to be one of them. Olivia let out a slow breath, rubbing her forehead before forcing a smile. "No, baby," she said softly. "We're just talking." Emma frowned, looking up at Ethan. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" The same question she asked every night. And suddenly, Ethan knew exactly what his decision was. He crouched in front of them, looking them both in the eyes. "Yeah," he said, voice steady. "I'm coming back tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that." Lila studied him, as if trying to decide if she could believe him. Then, quietly, "Promise?" Ethan's throat felt tight, because for the first time in his life a promise actually meant something. So he nodded. "I promise." And for once, he knew he wouldn't break it. As he left that night, stepping into the cool autumn air, he pulled out his phone. The London deal could wait. His family couldn't. And this time, he was choosing them. Ethan Callaway had made his decision. For the first time in his life, he had chosen something other than the company. And yet, as he stood outside Olivia's townhouse the next evening, he knew that choosing wasn't enough. He had to prove it. Because Olivia had every reason to believe this was temporary. Every reason to think that the moment things got complicated, he'd go back to what he knew. That was what he'd done before, and she was waiting for him to do it again. Not because she wanted him to fail, but because she couldn't afford to hope. Not for herself, and especially not for their daughters. When Olivia opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. Not because she hadn't expected him to come back, but because, for once, he was early. Ethan had canceled his meetings for the afternoon, told Daniel to handle the crisis at Callaway Holdings, and taken a rare luxury of time. Time that, for once, had nothing to do with business. Just them. "Hey," Olivia said, still holding the door open, her expression guarded. "Hey," Ethan echoed. A beat of silence. Then, the test. "You don't have to be here every night, you know," she said, her voice careful. "The girls don't expect that from you." Ethan studied her, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here because they expect it. I'm here because I want to be." Olivia held his gaze for a long moment, searching for cracks. Then she exhaled, stepping aside. "Come in." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't resistance either. And for now, that was enough. Dinner was comfortably chaotic. Emma and Lila had demanded to play music while they ate, which had resulted in an impromptu dance party around the table. Olivia had rolled her eyes, but even she had cracked a smile when Ethan had been peer-pressured into spinning Lila around the kitchen. And for a moment, just a moment, he had forgotten everything else. The company. The deal. The life he had built for himself outside of this house. Because this noisy, messy, imperfect moment, felt like something real. Something he didn't want to lose again. After the twins had been tucked in, Olivia lingered by the kitchen sink, rinsing off dishes while Ethan stood beside her drying them. It was a strangely domestic moment, one that shouldn't have felt as easy as it did. And yet, it did. Too easy. Too familiar. Which was why she was the first to break the silence. "So," she said, setting down a plate, "what's happening with London?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He had known this was coming. And if it had been anyone else, he could have dodged the question. Given a vague, polished answer and moved on. But this was Olivia, and she had never let him hide. "I told them no," he said simply. Olivia stilled, not dramatically, just for a second, like she wasn't sure if she had heard him right. Then she turned to him, brows furrowed. "You turned it down?" Ethan nodded, tossing the dish towel onto the counter. "Yeah." She studied him, her dark eyes sharp. "You don't turn down deals like that." "I do now." A beat of silence. Then she exhaled, shaking her head. "Ethan." He waited. For her to tell him he was making a mistake. For her to remind him that his career was his whole life. For her to push him away before she could believe this was real. But instead, her voice softened. "Why?" Ethan swallowed, gripping the edge of the counter. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not what he had done, but why. He could have given her a dozen answers. Because he wanted to be a father. Because he was tired of chasing things that never mattered. Because the idea of being across the ocean from his daughters for 6 months made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. But instead he just looked at her and said the only thing that was completely, brutally true. "Because I didn't choose you before," he murmured. "And I refuse to make that mistake again." Something flickered in Olivia's eyes. Not relief, not hope, but something close. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You're dangerous, Calloway." Ethan smirked. "That's not what you used to say." Her lips twitched. "Number it's not." A beat of silence. Then she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. And suddenly, he wasn't afraid anymore. Because Olivia wasn't telling him to leave. She wasn't shutting him out. She was letting him in. Even if it was only by an inch. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "We just take it one day at a time." Olivia hesitated. Then finally she nodded. One day at a time. That Ethan could do. As he left that night, stepping into the cool autumn air, his phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Board isn't happy about London. You sure about this?" Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment. Then slowly he typed back, "Yeah, I'm sure." And for the first time in his life, he actually meant it. Ethan Calloway had made his decision. London was off the table, the company could adjust. For the first time in his life, he had chosen something other than work. And it felt right. But just because he had made his choice didn't mean the world would let him have it so easily. Because if there was one thing he had learned in business, it was this. When you refuse to play the game comes for you. And today, it came in the form of a familiar voice at the worst possible moment. Ethan had taken the twins to the bookstore. A simple outing, nothing fancy, just an afternoon spent browsing aisles of colorful covers and listening to them debate whether they needed another book about talking animals. He had been getting better at this, at knowing when to step in and when to let them take the lead. Lila, ever the skeptic, had quizzed him on whether he knew anything about fairy tales. Emma had proudly declared that rich people probably don't read bedtime stories. Ethan had smirked, pulled a well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are from the shelf, and casually told them it had been his favorite as a kid. That had earned him serious points, until his past decided to crash the moment. "Ethan Calloway?" The voice was smooth, calculated, familiar. Ethan turned, instinct already preparing for the worst. And there she was. Victoria Langley, board member, power player. The woman who had spent the last 5 years ensuring Calloway Holdings remained at the top. And the person who had probably orchestrated the London deal in the first place. Her smile was razor-sharp, perfectly polished as she stepped closer. "I wasn't expecting to run into you here." Ethan stiffened, every part of him slipping into business mode, even as Lila and Emma watched the interaction curiously from the side. "Victoria," he greeted, keeping his voice neutral. "Didn't know you were a bookstore person." Her gaze flicked to the girls, taking in their identical faces, the way they stood close to him. Assessing, calculating. Then a slow smile. "Are these your—" Ethan cut her off. "Yes." A single blink. A slight tilt of her head. "Huh." Nothing else. Just that. Like she was adding the information to an equation, already figuring out what it meant for the company. Ethan kept his voice calm. "Something I can help you with?" Victoria smiled, too polite, too knowing. "The board has been having some concerns," she said lightly. "Your priorities seem to be shifting. Some are wondering if Calloway Holdings is still at the top of your list." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I didn't realize I needed to justify spending time with my family." Her smile didn't falter. "Of course not. But it does make people wonder if you still have the hunger for this." Ethan forced himself to breathe. This was a test. They wanted to see if he would cave, if he would reassure them that the company came first. And a year ago? He would have. Hell, 6 months ago, he wouldn't have even blinked at the question. But now? Now there were 2 sets of blue eyes watching him carefully. and a woman at home who was waiting for proof that he wouldn't run again. So he didn't cave. Instead, he tilted his head, meeting Victoria's gaze without hesitation. "I built that company," he said evenly. "I gave it everything, and unless I'm mistaken, profits are still climbing." Victoria smiled. "They are." "Then my priorities are exactly where they need to be," Ethan said, voice steel. A pause. Then Victoria's gaze flicked back to the twins, lips twitching in something close to amusement. "They have your eyes," she mused. Ethan tensed, instinctively stepping slightly closer to them. "Yeah, they do." Victoria studied him for another long second. Then, with an easy shrug, she pulled a book from the shelf. Art of the Deal. Classic. "Well, I hope you're prepared," she said lightly, tucking the book under her arm. "Because the board doesn't like uncertainty, Ethan. And if they think you're distracted—" She let the sentence trail off. A warning. A subtle threat wrapped in perfect professionalism. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, cool, controlled, utterly unbothered. "Then they should stop underestimating me," he said. Victoria's eyes flickered with something amused. Then she nodded once, gave the twins a final glance, and disappeared into the next aisle. Ethan exhaled. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But at least now he knew exactly what they were up against. The drive back to Olivia's house was quiet. Lila and Emma were uncharacteristically subdued, still processing whatever had just happened. When Ethan finally pulled into the driveway, Emma broke the silence. "That lady didn't like you very much," she observed. Ethan smirked. "She likes power more than people." Lila studied him. "Are you in trouble?" Ethan considered his answer. Then, honestly, "Not yet." Emma frowned. "Are they mad because you're with us now?" Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, because that was the real question, wasn't it? And the answer wasn't one he liked. "They're just adjusting," he said carefully. Lila's eyes narrowed. "That's a fancy word for mad." Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, it is." A beat of silence. Then Emma reached forward, patting his arm with a tiny, reassuring hand. "Don't worry, Daddy," she said, voice firm. "You can just tell them you're ours now." Ethan froze. Something lodged in his throat. Something he couldn't swallow down. She had said it so casually, so easily. Like it wasn't the most important thing he had ever heard. Like she had already decided. Like he was theirs. And in that moment, he knew. No amount of power, no billion-dollar deal, no corporate threat would ever make him walk away from this. From them. Because this was the only deal he had ever truly cared about winning. And he wasn't going to lose. Ethan Callaway had spent years commanding boardrooms. But tonight, as he stood in Olivia Carter's kitchen, watching her move around the space with practiced ease, he realized something. This was the only place he wanted to be. Not in a skyscraper office, not on the cover of Forbes, not fighting battles with men in tailored suits. Just here. Where life was messy and loud and real, where his daughters trusted him enough to call him Daddy, where Olivia's gaze softened just a little when she thought he wasn't looking. And yet, the real world wasn't going to let him have this without a fight. Because the moment he'd walked into this house tonight, his phone hadn't stopped buzzing. The board was pushing harder. Daniel had sent him a short but loaded text. "You need to deal with this." Now Victoria Langley had left a voicemail, her tone clipped and professional. "The board is convening an emergency meeting. I highly suggest you be there." And Olivia? She knew something was wrong. He could see it in the way she moved, in the way her shoulders stiffened when he didn't immediately answer a single one of those calls. He had never ignored work before. Not for her, not for anyone. and she was waiting for him to remind her why she couldn't trust him to stay. So, Olivia finally broke the silence, placing 2 plates on the table, her voice too casual. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Ethan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "What makes you think something's going on?" She shot him a dry look. "Because you keep looking at your phone like it personally betrayed you." Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "The board's not happy with me." Olivia gave a humorless laugh. "Shocking." He smirked. "I know, right?" She sat down, tilting her head. "So what's the problem this time?" He hesitated, because this wasn't just business. This was personal. "They don't like me spending so much time here," he admitted finally. Her fork stilled, then slowly she put it down. "That's what this is about?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Ethan nodded. "They're pushing hard." A long silence stretched between them. Then, the question he had been dreading. "So what are you going to do?" Ethan met her gaze, and he didn't hesitate. "I already made my choice, Olivia," he said, "and it wasn't them." Something flickered in her expression, something like relief, something like fear. She exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't get it." "What?" "You," she said, her voice quieter now. "You're Ethan Callaway. You don't just walk away from your company." Ethan leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table. "No," he agreed. "But I do walk away from things that don't matter anymore." She blinked. He saw the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, like she wanted to believe him, like she was scared to believe him. "Ethan!" A sudden crash from the living room cut her off. They both turned just as Lila's voice rang out, "That was your fault!" followed by Emma's indignant reply, "No, yours." Ethan sighed. "I should probably check on that." Olivia smirked. "Yeah, you should." But as he walked past her, her voice stopped him. "Ethan." He turned back. She swallowed, her expression unreadable. "Just don't make promises you can't keep." Ethan held her gaze, and then, quietly, firmly, "I don't." Then he walked toward his daughters. Because this was his life now. Ethan Callaway had always been a man defined by power, power in business, power in wealth, power in knowing that no matter the situation, he could fix it, control it, win it. But as he sat in the boardroom of Callaway Holdings, staring at the men and women who had once represented his entire world, he realized something. This wasn't his world anymore. His world was back in Brooklyn. His world had bright blue eyes and mischievous grins. His world smelled like cinnamon and vanilla candles, sounded like giggles before bedtime, and felt like the warmth of a woman who still had the power to unravel him with a single glance. And if he had to choose between the two, it wasn't even a question. Victoria Langley was the first to speak. "You've been distant, Ethan," she said smoothly, crossing her legs as she leaned back in her chair. "Your priorities have shifted." Ethan smirked, settling his hands on the table. "You mean I've stopped letting the company consume me?" Victoria didn't blink. "I mean you've stopped acting like the man we built this company with." He exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the polished mahogany. "That's where you're wrong, Victoria. I haven't stopped being that man." A murmur of interest rippled through the board. Ethan let the silence settle before speaking again. "I built this company from the ground up. I sacrificed everything to get it to where it is today. And for years I thought that was the only thing that mattered." He looked around the room, meeting each gaze with calculated precision. "But I was wrong." A few shocked glances exchanged. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly have you decided matters more?" Ethan leaned forward. "Balance." She scoffed, but he didn't give her time to interrupt. For years, I lived under the illusion that if I wasn't working, I was failing, that the only way to be successful was to be ruthless about it. And I was. I built an empire. I became a man people respected and feared. Another pause. Then, quieter, stronger. And I lost everything that actually mattered in the process. Silence. Someone shifted in their chair. Victoria's expression was unreadable now. Ethan took a breath, letting his voice settle into absolute certainty. I'm not walking away from this company, but I am done sacrificing my family for it. A sharp inhale from someone at the table. Ethan glanced at Victoria. If that makes me weak in your eyes, so be it. But if you think for 1 second that makes me any less of a leader, you're wrong. Silence stretched again, heavier this time. Then, applause. Not from everyone, not from Victoria, but from Daniel, from 2 other board members, and slowly, others followed. Victoria didn't clap, but she studied him like she was seeing him for the first time. Then she exhaled, standing up. Well then, she said, smoothing out her jacket. Let's see if you can prove it. She walked out. And just like that, Ethan had won. Not by control, not by fear, but by finally being the man he should have been all along. By the time he reached Olivia's house that evening, the sky was dark, the warm glow from the windows making the house feel impossibly inviting. Home. His home. Whether Olivia had admitted it or not yet, it was his home. He knocked, already hearing the twins racing to the door. Lila yanked it open first, eyes lighting up. You came back. Ethan smirked. You act surprised. Emma grinned. Mom said you might be late. Ethan shot a glance toward the kitchen, where Olivia was pretending to not be listening. Well, he said, crouching slightly. Tell your mom she was wrong. Lila smirked. I love when she's wrong. A snort from Olivia. I heard that. Ethan laughed, straightening up, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he reached out, sliding an arm around Olivia's waist. She stiffened for only a second. Then slowly she leaned into him. Not much, but enough. And when she finally looked up at him, something unspoken passed between them. A question, an answer, a promise. One day at a time. Together. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Calloway didn't want anything more. Because he already had everything. The words weren't meant to wound, but they did. Because she was right. Ethan had spent years in boardrooms, on planes, in penthouse suites with city views that stretched for miles. But he had never once imagined what was happening in a small house in Brooklyn, where 2 little girls with his eyes were growing up without him. I can't change the past, he said quietly. No, you can't. But I can be here now. Olivia studied him, her fingers tightening around her mug. And what exactly does that mean? She asked. You come around a few times a week, take them for ice cream, show up at birthdays with expensive gifts? Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know yet, but I know I want to be in their lives. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. Wanting isn't enough. Ethan met her gaze head on. Then tell me what is. She let out a humorless laugh, standing up abruptly. You don't get it, do you? She turned toward the sink, gripping the edge of the counter. I spent years making peace with the fact that you weren't here, that you were never going to be here. And now, all of a sudden, you show up and expect... I don't expect anything. She turned sharply. Don't you? For a second, neither of them spoke. Ethan saw it then, the fear buried beneath the anger. She wasn't just mad at him. She was terrified of believing in him again. Because if he let them down now, it wouldn't just be her that he hurt. It would be them. The realization hit him hard, stealing the words from his throat. The only sound in the kitchen was the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I don't know what you want me to say, Olivia. I can't change what happened. I can't erase the years I missed. But I can be here now. I am here now. Her eyes searched his, as if looking for cracks in his resolve. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't find any. She let out a slow breath, rubbing her temple. The girls like you, she admitted, almost reluctantly. And that scares me. Ethan swallowed hard. Why? Because they don't know what it's like to lose you. The words landed between them like a punch to the chest. Ethan's throat tightened. I'm not going to leave them. Olivia hesitated, as if she wanted to believe him, as if she wanted to let herself hope. But hope was dangerous, and Ethan Calloway had already broken her once before. She turned away, bracing her hands on the counter. We'll see, she murmured. It wasn't an acceptance, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a test, and Ethan had never been one to fail. Upstairs, Emma and Lila sat on the floor of their bedroom, listening. The voices downstairs were muffled, but they could still hear the tension in their mother's voice. Lila hugged her stuffed rabbit to her chest, frowning. Do you think he's going to leave? Emma hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know, but I think he wants to stay. Lila sighed. Mom's scared. Emma nodded. So is he. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Then Lila rolled onto her stomach, kicking her legs in the air. I like him, she admitted. Emma glanced toward the door as if expecting to hear footsteps approaching. Then, softer, me too. And for the first time, the idea of having a father didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a possibility. As Ethan left that night, stepping into the cool air, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about proving himself to Olivia. It was about proving himself to them. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Calloway had found something worth fighting for that had nothing to do with power, money, or success. It had everything to do with two little girls who had been waiting for him without even knowing it, and he would not let them down. Ethan Calloway wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed himself. In business, he made decisions swiftly, and once he committed to something, he saw it through. That was the key to his success, the ability to look at a situation, strip away emotion, and execute with precision. But this wasn't something he could strategize his way through. The girls weren't a contract to be negotiated. Olivia wasn't a deal waiting to be closed. And for the first time in his life, Ethan was in completely unfamiliar territory. But he wasn't walking away. So the next afternoon he went back. The Brooklyn neighborhood was busier today, filled with the sounds of children playing on the sidewalks, neighbors chatting on their stoops, and the distant melody of an ice cream truck winding through the streets. Ethan parked in front of Olivia's townhouse and walked up the steps, knocking firmly. He had barely lowered his hand before the door swung open. Lila stood there, blinking up at him with a skeptical expression. You again? Ethan smirked. You sound surprised. I'm not. I just thought maybe you got busy and forgot.